Welcome to Chapter 1, Political Foundations. The question we're going to be exploring in Chapter 1 is government necessary? It's in fact necessary. Now, at first blush, you may say to yourself, of course government is necessary. We need government. But I wonder, do you believe that government is necessary because you've always had government? Because everything in your life is somehow regulated by or affected by your government? Or do you in fact believe that government is necessary because you believe in the theoretical underpinnings of a society with rules and institutions? Well then, once we talk about whether or not government is necessary, we'll ask ourselves whether or not that government should in fact be limited. What power should the government have? What power should the government be without? And finally, if we agree that government is necessary and the role of the government should be limited, we will ask ourselves what kind of government system is most appropriate to ensure the safety of the people without having too much power. In order to ask ourselves, begin with a definition of what government is. We'll define government as the institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. Now, that definition is a pretty broad one, and it has several parts, and we're going to talk about those. Let's start with Thomas Hobbes. Some of you may have heard of the famous philosopher who talked about the life in what he described as the state of nature in his famous work, The Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes described life in the state of nature, that is, life in the absence of rules or regulations or institutions such as the police or a government. He described that life as one that would be brutal. It would be nasty, it would be brutish, and it would most likely be short. Now, to give you a modern-day example of Hobbes' state of nature, you only need to think about the GPC parking lot during the first week of school. Think back of that experience. Is it a delightful one where everyone is kind and generous and gives parking spaces to others and crosses the road at a reasonable pace and lets others merge or make left-hand turns or right-hand turns from the campus at an appropriate amount of time? Or is it an experience where people are essentially acting selfishly, sometimes violently, where people are stealing spaces or not allowing others to merge or crossing the street as if they have an entire lifetime to get to the other side? My guess is that you're probably thinking of the second experience, and that's exactly what Thomas Hobbes described as life in the state of nature. That when no one was looking, we would seek to act in our own best interest, and that we would act against the interests of others if it means taking care of ourselves and our own survival. Now, unless you'd like to live in that kind of world, I'm imagining you're going to argue that government is in fact necessary, that we do in fact want the procedures to rule ourselves and our territory. What are the procedures called? Laws. We have laws in our society that regulate behavior. That's essentially what laws are, right? Laws say that you can't murder or you can't steal. They are regulating your behavior. Additionally, the procedures that rule the United States and its people not only tell us how to behave, but have penalties for noncompliance. If you fail to follow the rules, you will be punished, sometimes severely. The purpose of those punishments are twofold. Number one, to hold you accountable for your actions so that you won't hopefully do it again. And two, to act as a deterrent for others so that they see you being punished and think to themselves, perhaps I don't want to commit that crime. What about the institutions of government that rule the people of the United States specifically? Well, we have several types of institutions in our government. Remember that in the United States, government is both separated amongst three branches and divided amongst two levels. The first is called separation of powers. Government is separated amongst three branches. So now that we know what the institutions of government are, and we've defined and discussed the procedures of our society, the next question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the proper role of government? What should our government do? What services should it provide? What forms of government are the most effective in providing these services to us? What role should citizens play in this government? And finally, what is required of us, the citizens? Government is necessary, it's probably... Remember, government is divided amongst three branches, separation of powers. But is it also divided amongst two levels? That's known as federalism. So let's first talk about the three branches of government. And you know these branches. They are the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Now, those three branches exist at both levels of government, the federal and the state. But they have different names. So let's define those. At the national level, the executive is called the president. The legislative branch is called the Congress. Now, remember, Congress has two chambers. It is bicameral. One is the House, and the other, the Senate. The judicial branch at the national level is called the Supreme Court. Now, the states have each of these same branches. We just call them by different names. In the state of Georgia, the executive, the governor. The legislative, we call our legislative branch in the state of Georgia the General Assembly. And the judicial branch is the Supreme Court of the state of Georgia. Each one of these levels regulates your behavior in many ways. These are the institutions of government that rule you at both the federal and state level in the United States. Now that we can agree government is necessary, the question begs asking, what is the most important role of government? What should that government do? Well, as a society, we have come up with a common set of goals, a common set of jobs, if you will, that we expect our government to perform. And let's talk about each of those. The first role of government is to provide public goods. A public good is defined as something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Now, those are fancy terms usually learned in economics class, and essentially what they mean is these are goods that are available to everyone. Whether you can afford them or not, they are available to you. And one person's having them and using them does not mean that another can't have them and use them. They're non-rivalrous, which means my using it doesn't diminish the supply for you. Think of some examples of public goods. Right, roads, libraries, schools, water treatment facilities. Those are all things that are provided to us by government. Why do we need government to provide water? Well, if anyone's ever heard of Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand or the Tragedy of the Commons, you know exactly why we need government to provide these services. Because, as Hobbes described earlier, man is inherently selfish, and man will use or take whatever he needs for his own survival. So think about it. If government doesn't provide things like clean water, it is likely that someone would use more than their fair share, and they would probably pollute the water source so that others wouldn't be able to use it. When government provides it, they ensure that everyone gets it and that the supply is not diminished for another. Why else should government provide public goods? So that everyone can afford them. Think about this. Fire protection. If it were provided in a private capitalist model, it would look something like this. Your house is burning down. You call the fire department. You tell them that your house is ablaze. The first question they ask you is, what is your zip code? Well, then you hear the old-fashioned calculator in the background, the kind with the paper and the heavy buttons. You hear them smashing away on the calculator, and they tell you that it's $100 per mile between your house and the fire station. They ask you for the square footage of your home and give you an estimate based on square footage. They ask you how many old people or elderly or kids you have in your house because, you know, those cost extra. They have to be assisted out of the home. And then in the end, the fireman tells you it's going to cost you $1,500 to put the fire out. Would you like us to come? Well, chances are you're going to tell them, no, I don't have $1,500 on me right now. I guess I'll have to let my house burn down. Nobody wants to have a capitalist model of public goods where not everybody can afford these sorts of services, so government provides them and then provides them to everyone regardless of whether you can pay for them. How are these services funded? They're funded through tax dollars. Everyone pays taxes. Not everyone pays the same amount, but those taxes are redistributed to ensure that all persons are given the benefits. Now, I'm not going to assume or I'm not going to ask you to believe that everyone gets the same level of fire protection or police protection regardless of where you live. We'll come back and address those questions and issues later on this semester. What other roles should government perform? They should protect us from foreign aggressors. This seems obvious. If we're being attacked by a foreign nation, you as an individual can do very little with your shotgun out in front of your house. Instead, we need a government to raise and fund a national military, and that's what the government does. We need government to maintain the public order. This goes back to what we talked about a few moments ago. Government creates rules and then enforces those rules through a police department and a judicial system. Now, the question about public order is not one that is easily settled, though, because the question becomes what kind of laws are necessary to maintain the public order. Most of us can agree that laws against rape or murder or theft are necessary to maintain the public order. But what about questions of abortion? What about questions of homosexuality? Are those questions necessary, or are those laws necessary for maintaining the public order? Again, we'll come back and talk about that later on the semester. We asked government to protect private property and to enforce contracts. This was something that was paramount to the founders. Remember that they had, living under the British king, King George, had no rights to property. And so when they came and founded the United States, it was important to them that they be given the right to own property and that government have limited rights to remove those properties. And perhaps the most controversial role of government is to provide equality and some measure of social justice to citizens. The question begs asking, is government responsible for ensuring that all citizens are treated equally and are treated with a basic level of humanity? Now, most of us can agree on public order, and we can agree that government should provide security from foreign aggressors. We can even agree that government should provide public goods, although we'll probably disagree over how those should be paid for in terms of taxing. But the question of equality is one that is far from settled. And when we come back and talk about Chapter 5 this semester, Civil Rights, we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about issues of equality and social justice and whether or not government has a role to play in those. So we see what government's obligations are to ensure a safe and orderly society. But then the question begs asking, what do you as citizens, what role, what responsibilities do you have in ensuring an orderly and just society? And how do our policies in the United States reflect these same priorities? This graphic gives you a sense of tax obligations around the world. As we talked about just a moment ago, public goods are funded through the redistribution of income taxes. By redistribution, I mean that some people, those with more income, pay more in federal and state income taxes. Those with less income pay less in federal and state income taxes. All of that money goes into the same pot, and then all individuals are given a basic level of service regardless of how much they paid in taxes. Now, it's often bemoaned by Americans that we have incredibly high tax rates, and that's not true. In fact, when you look at nations around the world, the United States has one of the least complicated and one of the lower tax rates amongst foreign nations. Let's take a look at this graphic. As you can see at the top, the United States of America, here we are, I'm showing you now. The United States of America citizens pay about 46% of their income in taxes. The number 11 there shows you how many times, these are actually corporations, not individuals, but how many payments a year corporations must pay in taxes. So you see in the United States, they pay 11. It takes roughly 187 hours to complete those forms, and they pay roughly 46% of their income in taxes. Compare that to other nations. At the bottom, you see the 5 most complicated systems. For instance, in the nation of Chad, corporations have to pay taxes 54 times a year. They have to make 54 payments, and they spend on average 732 hours a year in completing those forms and making those payments for a total tax liability of 65%. You can look at Belarus. In Belarus, companies there make 82 payments a year. They spend on average 798 hours completing those forms and making those payments for a total tax liability of 80.4%. So comparatively, the United States has a relatively moderate tax rate. Now that we've explored America's tax liability, at least as it relates to corporations, it's important that we shift our focus to how does government spend the money that it has. We just explored the roles of government. Now it's an opportunity for us to see how have we as a nation rank ordered those priorities. How have we set our budget priorities? How have we determined payments to reflect which of those roles we think most important? When you look at the federal budget, remember that the federal budget is roughly $4 trillion a year. And of that federal budget, you can see at the very top pie chart that 20% of that budget is spent on defense and security. So the government's role of protecting us from foreign aggressors is obviously one that we as a society have given a great importance. Additionally, 20% of the federal budget is spent on Social Security, providing for the care of elderly Americans, as well as 21% going to Medicare and Medicaid, which are programs to fund health care for the elderly and the poor. So when you look at the federal budget, about 60% goes to defense and care for the elderly, and somewhat for the poor, although Medicaid is a very small percentage of that 21%. In fact, care for the elderly makes up almost half of the federal budget. Comparatively, if you look at the bottom, education gets only 3% of the federal budget, and safety net programs altogether get 14% of the budget. By safety net, we mean things like welfare or food stamps or Section 8 housing assistance. So as you can see, we as a country have decided that defense and care for the elderly are our most important priorities, while education, care for the poor, and things like transportation and scientific research are relatively unimportant. So we've asked the question, is government necessary? And I think we can all agree it probably is. Then we explored what the proper roles of government are. So we have government, what should it do? And we looked at, in fact, budget priorities as reflective of what we as a nation think government should do. Now the question becomes, what kind of government is best suited to achieve those goals, to perform those roles? Now, governments are not all the same. Governments aren't equal. In fact, there are a variety of systems of government that have existed over history and that continue to exist around the world. Those can be categorized according to two separate questions. The first question is, who governs? When you look at the types of government based on who governs, you can organize them according to three broad classifications. The first is by single ruler. A single ruler government is called an autocracy. Examples: a monarchy, a dictator, a despot. Secondly, you have government that is organized and run by a small group. That type of government is called an oligarchy. An example of an oligarchy would be a government run by the wealthy, by the elite, by the bourgeois or the educated classes, or by the church, known as a theocracy. And finally, there is government that is organized and run by a large group of people. That is called, obviously, a democracy, by the people. So we, obviously, as a nation, have chosen democracy as our form of government. We have decided that in America, the people will, in fact, govern. Then the second question becomes, how much government control is allowed? There are three different types of classifications to answer this question. The first is a constitutional government, and in a constitutional government, there are formal limits that are placed on the powers of the government, usually in a written constitution, and these are both procedural and substantive. By procedural, I mean that there are clear procedures written out that the government must in fact follow. In the United States Constitution, you can find these in the Bill of Rights, in the Fourth Amendment, in the Fifth Amendment, in the Sixth Amendment, in the Eighth Amendment. Liberties that citizens have, such as government shall provide a right to an attorney or a right to trial. Government must follow those procedures and they cannot violate them. Additionally, In a constitutional government, the government often faces substantive restrictions. So, for instance, in the United States of America, a government may not pass a law or may not enact a procedure that denies to citizens equal protection under the law. You've probably heard of that. That is the 14th Amendment. Now, remember that constitutional governments vary in size and vary in scope. There are many nations around the world that have constitutions, but in those nations, the Constitution is all but ignored. In an authoritarian government, this government recognizes no formal limits. It is not restrained, but may be restrained by other social institutions. So in an authoritarian government, the leader, usually a dictator, will have absolute and total control over the government. For instance, Cuba is a good example. In Cuba, as you know, Fidel and now his brother Raul Castro have absolute control over the government. You do not become a member of that government unless you are a member of the particular party, and you do everything that the dictator asks. However, there are social institutions such as the church or the media, and sometimes even economic institutions that are able to push back, that have greater freedom, where the government doesn't have absolute control over those institutions. Unlike a totalitarian government, where the government has absolute control over the social, over the economic, and over the government institutions. An example here would be North Korea. This represents the spatial relationships between the three types of governments that we just discussed. On the left-hand side of the spectrum, you see a constitutional government, where the government itself has less control over the citizens and the institutions of that society, be they economic or social or in fact government. On the right-hand side of the spectrum, you see a totalitarian regime, where in fact the government has total or absolute control over all institutions. So moving from left to right, the type of government in fact has greater and greater control until you reach totalitarian, where it is absolute control over all of the society. This diagram presents a good example of the ways in which governments can attempt to have control over the social institutions within a society. What you are looking at here are the various flags from nations around the world, and these are the numbers and what they represent. For instance, if you look at the United States flag in front of you, you see in the upper right-hand corner 3,580. That is the number of requests received by Google from the United States government seeking information on users who have been searching for particular key phrases, things like revolution or Taliban or Muslim. Below the American flag, you see a continuum. You see the number 123, which is the number of requests that Google received from the United States government asking for data to be removed from its server. And of those 123 requests, 81% of were complied by Google itself. Now let's look at Brazil. In Brazil, you see that Google received slightly greater number, 3,663 requests for user information. They received 291 requests from the Brazilian government asking for data to be removed, and 83% of those were complied. Now, those are two Western nations. Let's take a look over on the right-hand side at some of the Eastern nations and how they compare. For instance, you can look at the country of India. India requested 1,061 different times information on users. Google received 142 requests for data to be removed from the server, and 70% of those were abided by Google. If you're interested, you can go to the website at the bottom of the page here and get a better picture. You can actually look at the diagram in greater detail. But I think it's important to see that when we talk about nations having control over the social institutions, it's not just the usual suspects. It's not just those Eastern, more authoritarian regimes. And in fact, there are many constitutional governments that in fact employ some of the very same practices used by those that are often labeled as dictatorships. Now that we've had the opportunity to explore the various types of government that exist in the United States, that exist in the world, and the type of government that has been chosen here in the United States, it's important to talk about the other element, which is politics. So we've discussed government. Now it's important that we talk about politics. Politics is defined as the conflict over the leadership, structure, and policies of government. As the famous political scientist Harold Laswell once said, politics is who gets what, when, and how. When we talk about politics in the United States, we spend a lot of time talking about what divides us, talking about the personalities of political candidates, or talking about the latest guffaw by a particular political figure. But in fact, politics is fundamentally a struggle between people over how government is going to be organized. So reflect back a few minutes ago. We talked about the role of government. We talked about how as a society we've prioritized those roles, and you saw an example of those in budget priorities. That is essentially what politics is. Politics is the process by which we struggle for control of the government so that we are able to define what our government will look like, what the policies of that government will be, how the government will be organized, and what roles it will be performed. So politics is a difficult process, and it's fundamentally about the way individuals see the world. Now, when we talk about democratic politics, there are a couple of different ways that politics can be formalized within a society. Now, as you know, we do live in a democracy as defined as a government by the many, a government by the people. However, there are several different kinds of democracies, and I know that you think, well, we've always had a representative democracy, but in fact, we employ both types of democracy in the United States, both representative and direct. And in fact, much of our politics has been, since the very founding, and continues to be today, a debate about what kind of democracy or what kind of democratic politics is most important and is most relevant in our current society. A representative system is one where we elect representatives to act on our behalf. That is a type of government that we obviously have on the national system. We talked about Congress. Rather than each citizen participating themselves, we elect representatives to act on our behalf, to represent us. Same thing for the president. We also do this on the state level with our state legislatures. We have decided that with a nation as large as ours and as complex as ours, it would be all but impossible to have a form of government where everybody would directly participate. That's known as a direct democracy. It's impractical. So we've instead created a representative form of democracy. However, we still use direct democracy in some ways in the United States. For instance, often at the local level, citizens will be able to directly participate in town hall meetings or school board meetings. Citizens will be able to vote directly on policy. You've probably heard of the term proposition before. A proposition is something that states use that allows citizens to vote directly on law. For instance, you've probably heard of California's proposition for medical marijuana. Citizens in the state of California were allowed to vote directly on whether or not its citizens should be allowed to use marijuana, and they passed it. It became a law. Now, not all states allow their citizens to vote in that form. In fact, only 11 of the 50 states do. Other states allow citizens to vote through something called a referendum. We have these here in Georgia. Anytime the Georgia legislature wants to amend our state constitution, it must be put to a vote. You're probably all familiar with the recent vote that the state of Georgia had on a county-by-county basis, deciding whether or not those areas wanted to allow Sunday alcohol sales. That's an example of a referendum. That's an example of direct democracy. So we don't have one or the other. We have both, and they work together in tandem, yet we're constantly debating how much power the people should have and whether or not that power should be increased or decreased. In fact, next week, when we talk about Chapter 2 in the Constitution, we'll come back and revisit this issue and look specifically at what the framers thought about direct democracy and how much power they thought that the citizens should be given. At the bottom of the PowerPoint, it's important to just jump in here. You see a definition for power. And power is, in fact, having a share or say in, again, how government is organized, what the leadership will look like. and what the policies are going to be. And again, this is the fundamental debate that happens in the United States, where each group, the two main groups we have are obviously the Democrats and the Republicans, each seek to have power so that they can control the government and they can make those very important decisions. Now that we've spent considerable time looking at what a government should be and what a government should do, it's important that we look at the other side of the coin, which is what is required of citizens. Several things are addressed in your book, and I want to simply acknowledge each of these. Now, we're not going to discuss them in great detail today, and we will come back and talk about each one of them as we move through the semester, but let's simply define them. The first thing that is required of a good citizen is to trust its government. You may have heard of the word legitimacy. Legitimacy is important because if citizens trust their government, if they see it as being legitimate, they're more likely to listen to it and follow the rules. If you don't have citizens willing to follow the rules or the laws, you're not going to have a stable society. You're going to have, in fact, upheaval and unrest and anarchy. So it's important that citizens trust their government. It's also important that citizens view their government as being legitimate. Now, again, I know you're thinking to yourself, well, government has to earn that trust. And while that is very true, citizens also have to follow their end of the contract, which is, in fact, to follow the laws and follow the rules. The second thing that citizens must have is political efficacy. Efficacy is the belief that your actions make a difference. Citizens have to believe that their participation will make a difference in the outcome. They have to believe that they matter, that their government listens to them, that their government considers their beliefs and positions. And finally, they have to have knowledge of government and its policies. Now, this was something that we explored in last week's discussion boards, and as many of you indicated, citizens have very little knowledge of how their government operates and what their government does on a day-to-day basis. Without that information, though, it's impossible for citizens to assess what their government is doing and whether or not they are in fact being represented. It's impossible for them to know how to best impose their interests on the government, and it's impossible for them to know what they can expect of government and what they should expect. So citizens need to be knowledgeable. They need to believe that their actions make a difference, and they need to trust in their government and see it as being legitimate and real. These are the things that are required of good citizenship.